Welcome to this episode of Theologically Driven. I'm Phil Cecil, and today I'm joined by Pastor Ben Edwards. Ben, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Yeah, glad to be back, right?
That's right.
Yeah, so Ben, for those who may not know, if you've just recently started listening to the podcast, Ben was the first host of the podcast. We originally came up with the idea together, and Ben hosted it, I produced it, and that was a fun project to get to work on. I think we did at least 150 episodes.
Yeah.
It was a little bit above that. So thankful for Ben and his ministry there. Today we want to think a little bit about your transition from here at ICBC and DBTS to where you're at now. So you're now the senior pastor of the Cross Lanes Bible Church in Cross Lanes, West Virginia. Before we get to that ministry, I want to talk a little bit about Inner City and your time here at DBTS. What originally brought you here? What were kind of the circumstances leading up to that when you first came on staff?
So I was finishing up a master's degree at Northland International University and was thinking through maybe the next step in preparation for service to the Lord. And at the time, I kind of thought, boy, it'd be great if I could get four things. It'd be great if I could get more theological training. Mm-hmm. I knew I needed to get more than just the MA. And then I also thought it'd be great if I could really get church ministry experience, if I could, have some opportunities to serve within a local church. And then I was thinking about missions possibly, and so I thought it'd be great if I could get cross-cultural experience just to kind of get a taste of that. And then some teaching experience, some opportunities to actually teach and lead Bible studies and things like that. And had some connections here to the church, and they were looking to bring someone on, and it basically offered all of those things because I could go to seminary, I could be a part of a good church, a lot of cross-cultural opportunities around here, and then as well some opportunities the position had to do some teaching, to do some Bible studies. And then one of the added bonuses was I was dating at the time the woman who's now my wife, and she's Canadian, and she was finishing up schooling and probably would need to stay in Canada for a little bit to get to licensing. And with Windsor being right across the river, it was convenient to be able to be here where we could still interact.
Yeah, good, very good. What you mentioned that wanting the cross-cultural experience. What was when you first started? You were heading up the ministry here at Wayne State. So that's an outreach ministry that we have that helps, trying to reach out to college students here who are at the university. Could you say a little bit about that and what the purpose of that is?
Yeah, so we, the church, shortly before I got here, opened up a chapter of Campus Bible Fellowship at Wayne State University. And the goal was to minister to all the students there, but there is a decent amount of international students at that university. And so there was always a heavy emphasis on that ministry. And so for many years, we had large groups of Chinese students, Indian students who would come to different programs and things we had. Sometimes it was utilizing a little bit of English conversation partners just to help them improving their conversational English, but we'd often gear that as well towards, let's do some Bible study with it. And so I did a lot of that, as well as just general outreach to students there at Wayne State University. And so would hold Bible studies on campus. We're able to lease a property basically right in the middle of Wayne State. It's an urban university, and so it's kind of spread within the city, and so we were able to lease a property right there, and we were able to do some Bible studies there at the property too, and so was able to be involved in that for about 8 years when I first came on staff here.
Yeah, that's great. What other types of ministries did you serve in while you were here?
So while I was doing the campus ministry, I also pretty quickly added in leading the young adult ministry here at the church. We call it the Crossroads ministry here just because it's a time in life in which a lot of things are happening, decisions, crossroads. And so I led that ministry for about 9 years. Partway through that, I also stepped into the role of executive pastor at the church, really trying to organize, administrate, oversee the kinds of things that were happening within the church here. For a time during that, I also oversaw all of our children's and youth ministries, not directly, but the pastoral person with oversight for that. And then several years ago, Pastor Dorn asked me to step in at the seminary to help lead the seminary and serve as the dean of the seminary there. And so I gave up some of the church responsibilities to be able to focus at the seminary, but remained on the church as a pastor, as an associate pastor of discipleship.
Yeah, that's a lot of different things and different types of experiences. I'm curious. This is kind of a personal question, so you don't have to answer if you don't want to. But were there things you learned that you were doing and you thought, "Man, I really love this," and maybe I don't like this quite as much? Like you just found like just the way you work, the types of gifting you have that you thought, this was really helpful, beneficial. I thought I excelled here, and maybe some others you didn't like as much.
Yeah, and that's one of the value of being able to be exposed to different aspects of ministry. And I'm thankful I had that. It's in a ministry like this, you can sometimes be a little bit focused. You can have a part of what's happening in church life. And that can be good, but the downside is you don't get quite as much exposure as you would more broadly. And even with the positions I had, there were aspects of ministry I didn't get as much experience as you would if you were the sole pastor of a smaller church. And certainly through that, you begin to see, giftings, desires, but there's also responsibilities. And the reality is for ministry generally, you have things that you enjoy, you do well at. There's other things you still have to do. And you can't give up one or the other. I think you can lean into what you are good at and try to maximize that, while also working hard to shore up some of the things that aren't your strengths.
Sure. No, that's good. And you were on staff here for, was it 16 years?
Yeah, 16 years.
Yeah, 16 years. So while you were here, a lot of the church members listened to the podcast, and I think they would be curious to know, what has impacted you the most from the ministry here? Certainly, you've had huge impact on a lot of people. I'm one of those people. When you taught Crossroads, I was one of the students in Crossroads when I moved up here. And even just being over at the seminary, you taught me homiletics. So even in my own life, I've been so thankful for your ministry. But I'm curious how this place, the church, the school, how has that impacted you and helped you grow in ministry?
Yeah. This is where I learned really my theology. It's really where I learned my philosophy of ministry. And one of the things I loved about being here is that I would be in the classroom and hear what was being taught, and then I'd see it taught in the pulpit, and I'd see it fleshed out in the ministry, and I heard it being permeated in staff meetings and in discussions among staff members and things like that. And so it was a place in which I really learned a good philosophy and a good theology. And part of that's because I think Dr. Doran is maybe the best pastor I know at actually having a ministry philosophy that is sought to be implemented within the church.
Sure.
Sometimes people give lip service and they want to say, hey, we want to be intentional about what we do, but he definitely is.
Yeah.
And he's thought very carefully about what the church is supposed to do and works very hard to try to make sure that is fleshed out in the life of the church. And I think I couldn't help but see that. I couldn't help but see that aspect of pastoral ministry, pastoral leadership, and inevitably that's something that I learned and hope to carry on, as I go out from here. But then the church itself, it's a church, and it does what a church is supposed to do. The people in the church ministered to me and my family. When we got married, they helped shower us with gifts. When we had children, they showered us with gifts. They brought over meals. When there were sicknesses, they sent notes. They were praying with us when we lost family members. And we got to see people in the church faithfully serving Christ. That they're living out life like it's supposed to be lived out, and we're seeing them, people who we know are very busy, people who we know have a lot to do, sacrificing their time to serve in the church. People that we know have gone through incredibly difficult trials and tragedies in their lives, continuing to worship Christ, continuing to follow Him, and so all of those things had an incredible impact on me and on my family, and then with the seminary as well. I can't say enough how much I appreciate the faculty at the seminary. Many of them were my teachers, mentors, examples of what theologians and scholars are supposed to be, as well as friends in my life.
Yeah.
And so inevitably this is a place that had an incredible influence on me, and I think will continue to do that for the years to come.
Yeah. I forgot to mention at the beginning, but we're recording at the E3 conference, and so if you hear people in the background, we're out in the atrium where all the exhibitors are, so if you hear some noise, that's what's going on. Just to follow up with that thing about the church, you were a little older when you came here than I was when I started, but similar timelines of getting married, and that's your 20s into your 30s. That's such a formative time in life, and I think about our church here as just such an exemplar church. The people really, they jump in, and they want to serve, they want to help. And when people ask about, even for me, like they'll ask me like, how is the church doing, or how has been your time there? I've basically spent my 20s here. I got married here. We had our kids here. We bought our first house here, and the church has been there at each of those phases to come alongside us, to help us, to love on us, and that impact is just immeasurable, I think. So it's just excellent the way that's worked out. So now, been here for a while, serving here, and you recently have become the pastor of the Cross Lanes Bible Church. When did that transition happen?
Well, officially, I started the first Sunday of September.
Right, and we're now in the middle of October, so it's been about a month and a half.
It's been 7 Sundays.
Seven
that
Sundays.
I've been at the church there. Yeah.
How did that opportunity come about? What was the connection to the church? All of that.
So I grew up in that church. My family started attending that church when I was 3. That's the church where I heard the gospel. I got saved while I was at that church. I got baptized in that church. It's the first church I joined, and so. This church also has a Christian school. That was a Christian school I attended kindergarten all the way through my senior year. And so I've known that church for a very long time. The kind of the connection came about that actually basically E3 of last year. I got contacted by a gentleman who had been my high school science teacher. He was serving at the time as the chairman of the pulpit committee. The senior pastor had been serving there for almost 20 years over 20 years at that point in time. I had announced about a year and a half prior he needed to retire just with some health concerns, and had kind of said, I can stick around through the summer of 2024, but I can't stay any longer than that. And so they'd started looking for a pastor, been looking for a year and a half, hadn't found anyone, and he reached out and said, hey, would you be interested? And I felt at that point in time I couldn't simply say no. I thought the answer probably would be no, just because I loved where I was, I loved where I was serving, but I felt like I at least needed to explore it and pray about it. And so that's kind of how we initially got started. Then started talking with the pulpit committee. Into February, the pulpit committee was then ready to recommend me to the deacons. And the process at that church is the pulpit committee recommends to the deacons, and then the deacons recommend to the church, and then the church has to call the senior pastor at that point in time. And I thought, well, I think if I'm going to take the next step, I need to feel confident that I could take all of the steps. Mm-hmm. And prayed about it, got counsel, and said, I just don't think I can do that right now. And so I said I need to remove myself from a candidate in February, but I'm going to be praying that the Lord, brings someone to lead this church, because it's a church that's had incredible work from the gospel, and I think great opportunity for continuing work for the gospel, and yet needs some life breathed back into it in some ways right now.
And the Lord answered that prayer.
And He did. He did answer that prayer, I hope. But answered it by working in my heart to basically make me willing to leave. That was a big step, and just, being willing to potentially move on from a ministry that we love. That was a frightening idea. And to confirm that this is where we needed to go. And so we re-engaged in late April and met with the deacons in early June, and then in late June candidated with the church, and beginning of July they voted to call me to become the next senior pastor. And so that was kind of a quick transition at that point in time.
Yeah.
And that was partially because we wanted to get down there with the Christian school, to be down there in time for our kids to be in the school and for me to be there when the school started.
Yeah, good. What did I'm curious what the candidating process looks like. You mentioned a little bit about how the deacons recommend and then that they recommend to the church. But different places it looks different. What did the candidating process look like? What were some of the steps you had to take there?
Yeah, so when they reached out to me, they had a form I had to fill out, providing some questions they had. And it's interesting. I've seen various churches through the years. I've seen different forms they have, and often what gets on that form is kind of clues you into the concerns the church has.
Sure.
And so sometimes it's a mix of theological questions and kind of cultural or practical questions, and they're just kind of wanting to get a sense of where do you stand on these things. And so I filled all of those out. We were having discussions with the pulpit committee, and I said, I've got a lot of questions I'd like to ask you guys. And so I gave them a set of questions as well, and the pulpit committee very graciously filled those out. That helped me get a sense on two levels of where these individuals were and what they thought about the church, and then a little bit better sense of, okay, so what's actually happening in the church, and what are people's concerns, what kind of pastor do they think they need? Because that was a question I had. I think generally a godly person can serve as a pastor of a church, but ideally, just like marriage, two godly people can get married. But it's kind of nice if you can think through,
is this a good fit?
Better, yes,
yeah,
a better
sure.
fit. And so it's not simply, of course we can serve forever. It's also, is this going to work well? And so I was getting some sense of, are they in a place that, do they want a pastor like me, or do they want a different kind of pastor?
And that's not necessarily a bad thing either. It's just different types of churches, different giftings, and different needs in different areas. Someone may need someone who's very heavily evangelistic or, heavy in more teaching types of things. But no, that's great. Were there any concerns during the candidating process, or any specific issues you thought, okay, we need to talk about this, or we need to think this through?
So I think the biggest concern I had was I wanted to be very upfront and open about who I am, what I believe, and what I would see the church to be in practice. And so there were a couple of things within the church's doctrinal statement that I wanted to get some clarity on and make sure that they were okay, that I may not actually fully affirm one of the things. So I'll give an example. The church's doctrinal statement is trichotomous. They believe, it specifically states that man is body, soul, and spirit, 3 parts. And I'm not a trichotomist.
Right. Yeah.
And I don't necessarily, personally, wouldn't put that in the doctrinal statement one way or the other.
Sure. Yeah.
But if that's the church's doctrinal statement and they need me to fully affirm that, then I can't be their pastor. and that's the kind of thing that I think it's wrong for a pastor to go into a church thinking, well, I don't really believe it, but I'll eventually change it.
Right.
If I'm saying, hey, I would like to change this, I'm going to tell you, I want to do that. If you're calling me, you're saying you're okay with me beginning to make that kind of a move. And so I wanted to be very upfront because I'd much rather, in the candidating process, have an issue come up where they say, boy, this is going to be a problem. And I say, okay, then let's not move forward.
Right.
Rather than move your family there, transition, and
quit your previous
we didn't
job.
know this was going to be a problem.
Yeah.
So I wanted to make sure I was upfront with them as much as possible, and I asked them to be as upfront with me as much as they could as well in the process.
Yeah, that's great. What are some of the new initiatives? Obviously, 7 weeks isn't a very long time, but I'm sure you have plans and things that you're excited about. What are some new initiatives that you're looking forward to, or maybe have already started to implement?
So I've tried actually to pull myself back and not to do new initiatives.
Okay.
At least for a while. I don't know that I'm fully successful. It's a balance of trying to think through, at some level, they're going to expect you to do things a little bit differently because you're not the previous pastor. And yet I've tried to kind of think, I don't really want to make any significant changes for a time. Certainly not any big changes. I wanted to kind of come in and just focus in on what you're supposed to do as a church: preach the word, sing the word, pray the word, and reintroduce what we're working through. So actually one of the people in the church said, you kind of remind me of that coach who every year comes in and says, all right, guys, so this is a football. And this is how so it's kind of, let's get back to the basics. Let's make sure we're all understanding these kinds of things again. And then from there begin to think through, okay, so what are we going to be doing as a church? So I've tweaked some things. Certainly people, if you ask them, they'd probably say, oh, yeah, we made some changes. But I've tried to not really make major changes at this point in time or really start new initiatives. Instead, to try to say, let me focus on the people who are here. Let me get to know the people who are here. Let me seek to shepherd the people who are here. And then as a church, let's begin to think through what could we be doing to strengthen our church and to grow our church.
Yeah, you got to have that. You got to have the foundation, because if everyone is confused on the foundation, you're not going to be able to build up things or even push forward on a lot of stuff. So that's good. That's great.
And I want to say this too. I had the privilege, thankfully. Like I said, I've been in this. I was in this church for 20 years, and so I've known its history in some level for almost 40 years. And the pastor, when I was very young, was there for about 22 years. He started the Christian school, heavily influenced in the church. He was actually back in town one of the first weeks I was at the church, and graciously offered to have lunch with me. And so I was able to pick his brain a little bit. And he left that church to go to pastor another church when he was 49. And he was talking about that transition, stepping into the ministry where he was. And he said, he didn't realize all the issues that were there when he was stepping into that ministry. He kind of got in and had, didn't know all these kinds of concerns. And so he said, he talked to his wife and said, all right, we're just going to have to plow ahead, and we're going to just faithfully preach and teach and lead, but lead gently and slowly. And said, my goal was I never wanted to throw a rock in the pond. Never wanted to have those ripple effects that really disturbed things, and yet would gently and carefully push. Yeah. And so I was already thinking that way, but that was very helpful to kind of hear him as well reinforce that, knowing the history of the church, and a very godly, wise man. And so I was thankful for that counsel, and that's something I've been trying to keep in mind as well.
Yeah, that's good. Obviously, one of the new things you're doing, you preached here regularly. You've taught Wednesday nights here for a number of years, I think. But now you're probably preaching more. How's that transition going, and what have you decided to kind of use? What are you preaching through, types of series you might want to do?
Yeah. In some ways, it's not a lot different in that I would have several preps during the week here. It'd just be a little bit different venue, and it wasn't Sunday morning. So that's the big change, is now I've got the Sunday morning. And I think probably connected to that, one of the biggest differences is I actually can kind of plan the whole service. And so trying to think through order of service, trying to think through song selection has been one of the bigger differences for me in this role. And then as well, being able to think through, okay, so what do I want to teach in the church? How am I going to do that, and when? And so I've got some different slots that I'm trying to think through. All right, so is this going to be better to do it in this kind of a slot, or is this going to be better to do it in a different slot? So one example of this is I'm planning right now in the month of November to kind of take all the adult classes and just do a combined adult class in the auditorium and teach a new members class.
Okay.
Because even the members that are there, I want them to know what I think the Bible says about what the church is and what church membership is and how that's supposed to function. And so I that could have maybe been a Sunday series. It could have maybe been a Wednesday night series. But I thought, well, let's just do it in the Sunday school slot. And those are the kinds of things that I'm now having to think through and evaluate as to when I'm going to cover what and how long. I mean, you get a lot of options. There's a lot of flexibility to be able to do those things.
Yeah, that's good. Have you thought about, so with that new members class, since you are planning to actually do it like that, are you thinking it's going to be just like some basic ecclesiology kind of things? Or, one of the things you mentioned about here was the philosophy and how that boils down. I mean, are you planning to kind of try and implement your own philosophy there, or it's really just kind of like, what is the church? This is who we
for that
are.
members class. There's going to be a little bit of it, but it's going to be much more ecclesiology.
Okay. Yeah.
The philosophy is going to be coming out in other venues at other times.
Yeah. Good.
And so that's hopefully you have to build that.
Yeah.
Right. I don't know that you can just simply come in and slap down, here's the philosophy, get on board.
Right.
You've got to teach it. And I've already started to do that through some of the sermons I've done, and even within some of the sermons. And then I also am kind of taking a little bit of a time to just do maybe occasionally a brief pastoral talk right before I do the scripture reading.
Okay.
Just to maybe hit something about this is why we're doing this in the church, or this is why we're trying to do this, and use that as a teaching time, not a formal sermon, but just kind of a brief pastoral leadership opportunity within the Sunday morning service.
That's good. Now that you're planning the services, what does like a normal service, like a Sunday morning, what kind of slots have you put into that?
Yeah, so I certainly don't think this is the be-all, end-all. This was one of those things where I thought, well, I don't want to change too much of what's happening, but I'd like to just tweak a few things. And so we have someone come up at the beginning, kind of welcome people, maybe give a couple of announcements, and then they read a call to worship from Scripture and pray. And then initially I did 3 songs back to back. And then we'd do a Scripture reading and a pastoral prayer, and then we'd do 3 songs back to back and a sermon. And I was told, we can't stand that long. And so we've started just doing 2 songs now, back to back in those slots. And it was partially just, I love congregational singing, and I want to get a lot of songs in.
Right.
But it doesn't really matter, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's something you can easily flex on one way or the other.
Yep.
And so that's kind of our structure. So then pastoral prayer, a couple more songs, sermon, a hymn, closing hymn, usually kind of trying to flesh out what was discussed in the service. And then I have someone come up and read a benediction as a closing to the service.
That's great. Well, Ben, thank you so much for being on the podcast, and thank you for thoughts about transitioning into the ministry. We're so thankful for you and your faithful ministry here, and we really pray the Lord's blessing on the ministry there at Cross Lanes. So,
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Theologically Driven. We're a podcast of Detroit Baptist Theological Seminary. If you'd like to learn more about our seminary, you can go to dbts.edu.